Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Budget Study Session number 1 on May 7, 2013 for the City of Glendale. May we have a roll call, please?
Council members: Friedman.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Harrow.
Here.
Sinanian. Mayor Weaver.
Here. I guess there's no introduction other than to go to you, Mr.
Actually,
Chilla.
we...
Oh, roll call.
yeah,
Well, you did that.
We need a roll call for the Finance Authority.
I'm sorry, I forgot about the finance. Okay.
Finance Authority members: Friedman.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Sinanian. Mayor Weaver.
Here.
The
Mr.
report is the following. The agenda for the May 7, 2013 joint public meeting of the City Council and the Financing Authority was posted on Friday, May 3, 2013 on the bulletin board outside City Hall. Mr. Mayor, I apologize. Normally we do have these as a study session, but because there will be action, this was a special meeting, so there was a report.
Okay, did I forget to bring in a sheet with the agenda and everything on it?
Certainly. Item 1 is Director of Administrative Services Finance regarding budget study session fiscal year 2012-13, third quarter financial update and year-end financial projection. At 1A is council motion to note and file report. B is council resolution adopting $1,451,417 to fund third quarter budget adjustments to the adopted 2012-13 budget. C is council resolution authorizing the abatement of the lease agreement for the GTV6 facility and abatement of the PEG fees to the City of Glendale Financing Authority. And D is Financing Authority resolution authorizing the abatement of the lease agreement for the GTV6 facility and abatement of the City of Glendale's assignment of PEG fees to the City of Glendale Public Financing Authority.
All right, Mr. Sinanian is now on board. I apologize, Mr. Elliott. I didn't bring my copy of the agenda items in here, so I apologize.
No worries.
So now we'll get underway with Mr. Chol, probably going to Mr. Elliott in a bit.
Most certainly, sir. As we get our PowerPoint underway, I welcome you to the first of several scheduled budget study sessions and or special meetings for the coming 13-14 budget. We have a set agenda for you, both in terms of the actions that we're asking you to take, but also an overview of what we expect to discuss during the month of May in 4 successive study sessions, this being the first, as I say, where we will, as you recall from last year, look at our third quarter numbers, show you what our projections are for the year end, run through our, go to the next one, run through our organizational profile, also provide some detail for the council in terms of a couple of items that we want to address by way of cleanup for the current year, especially as they impact the future, and also take a look at a development that you are familiar with through previous litigation as it relates to GTV6 and our PEG fees and the disposition of those fees. Lastly, John Toctalian, and as you indicated, Mr. Mayor, we'll have kind of a tag team approach from Mr. Elliott, myself, and then we will turn it over to Mr. Toctalian, our Deputy City Manager, to talk very briefly about our third quarter indicators and our department dashboards, all basically priming us for the next several study sessions that will deal respectively with revenues and 5-year forecast, and as well as our CIP and then the actual departmental program budgets on May 28th. So with no further ado, we will jump in, and Mr. Elliott will walk you through our general fund resources.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Let me walk you through the third quarter update, and we'll proceed from there. The revenues are tracking pretty much as we would expect them to. They are significantly lower in total volume, with the big variance being we're not transferring each month. The GWP electric transfer at this point in time would be about $16 million had we done it throughout the year, but we do it now at the end of the year. Additionally, we've had the settlement of the property tax administration fees with the county, so that's now included in there, and we'll talk about that later as a proposed amendment to the budget. Sales tax and property tax are trending upwards, which is good. So we've revised our estimates upwards in those areas. One area of concern still is the property tax from the state of California. We were hoping to get $1.4 million. We've only gotten about $800,000, I think, at this point, but there's still potential for getting additional 1.5 this year. That's from the dissolution of the GRA. And we're hoping to get another payment in June of this year. We've also, and we'll talk about this later, which is the reason why we're having the financing authority as well. If you recall, we had a lease structure between the financing authority and the general fund for the PEG fee, special revenue fund for the cable fund, and that was about $549,000 a year that came back to the general fund. We have eliminated that, and we'll walk through why we have done that. It's primarily the result of the lawsuit that we had with Charter. Let me jump to the numbers by the different categories. You can see the original adopted budget, where we think the revised resources are. One particular increase is the license and permits. That's primarily the business building permits that signify the increase in the building activity, and that's gone up dramatically for this year. We've actually notched it down for next year because of the spike in building for this year. Some of the other adjustments, the interest use of money, that's just reduction in interest earnings as we're at historic lows in that category. And charges for services we're eliminating. We eliminated and contracted out fingerprinting in-house, so we're now doing that out, so we don't have that revenue anymore. But there's cost savings on the flip side of that. So all in all, our overall revenue at this point is actually ahead of last year on a comparable basis, but doing quite well. In terms of expenditures, we're at 72.2% through 9 months. Again, if you straight line, that we would be on a 75% clip. So we're below that. We're actually a little bit better than we were last year at this time, the 121 versus 123. All the departments are doing well, and I'll show you all the detail in a minute. The fire department is a little bit higher than 75%. That has to do with some of the expenses that we put through in the first part of the year with the retirement incentives and other things that we rearranged in the budget through August through December of this year. So we're pretty confident that they'll meet their budget at the end of the year. So by the numbers through the departments, we've had some adjustments and some carryovers in the this column here. The largest you'll note, and if you recall, we had retirement incentives through PARS, and for the GFFA, totaling $1.6 million. Of that, we've spent $1.4 so far this year, so that should be where we think it will be towards the end of the year. So again, as I stated earlier, we're at $121 million, or 72% through the third quarter in the general fund. Cash balances. As of the end of March, $393 million. And I will tell you, a big chunk of this was moved in April when we finally moved cash from the city to the successor agency account. So this number will go down by $40 in the month of April. So this is a little bit overstated. Water fund, we've in the past, there were approximately $20 million negative. You recall we floated some bonds. That's included in this, so they now have positive cash, but a majority of that is bond cash at this point. So that's our overall cash in the various funds through the end of March.
As we talk, as we talk about the year-end projection, it's important because I think this is kind of the tale of the tape for where this organization has been. If you recall, we entered this current fiscal year with a $15.4 million general fund deficit on the heels of cutting $18 million the previous year and a significant amount the year before. when you consider the restructuring that went on in this current year, the loss of positions, the retirement incentive, the unfortunate series of layoffs that we did in the wake of the retirement incentive, as we really look to restructure and find what the fighting weight of our organization was, we still asked all of our departments to execute the work plans that they largely had done in previous years. What you see here is the results where both through revenue growth and through just the good work of our departments and our employees who are here before you today, we expect to end the year with about $3.9 million surplus. Considering that we were counting on using $1 million of fund balance, that would leave us at the end with $4.9 million. That is something that deserves to be recognized for the hard work of the folks in the audience. Moreover, if you recall from our mid-year budget presentation, we had talked about how we were looking possibly at a relatively small fiscal year 2014 deficit, but that we probably could shore up a good deal of that by holding harmless all of the general fund departments for increases in deposits to the internal service funds, and to the tune of putting money into those accounts, but not increasing the amount of money we put into those accounts. Because we're able to save, or we were able to come in under budget to this degree, we will be recommending at year end to move $3 million into those internal service funds. We'll also hold about $800,000 in the general fund in abeyance, either to hedge against what we expect departments to do in the final quarter as we get to the finish line, and possibly even consider any other one-time expenditures at the discretion of City Council. At the end of the day, I'm sorry, sir, go ahead.
Question. Well, why do we have to use that $1 million that we were thinking of using because we were going to be short, but in reality we're 3.9 ahead? Shouldn't we just say,
It accrues,
thanks but no thanks?
It accrues back here. You still see it there. We're effectively not going to be able to. We're not going to use
That just shows the variance between what we had planned and what the forecast is. So the difference is $4.9 million, but we would be, instead of using $1 million of fund balance, we'd have 3.9 added back. So it's a $4.9 million variance. So we would not use that.
Okay. Because it's sort of, it shows that there's a net increase, and with that money we would have opportunities to spend it.
We could, although what we're recommending is that you don't, that you move it, you spend it on the organizational infrastructure of the internal service funds here. Still hold something in abeyance there, but this is your adopted budget, and we did count on spending it. At this point, we don't have to spend it. We will hold on to that.
And later on, I'm sure, but I just want to make certain that we're going to discuss those fundings to the ISFs, what it consists of, and
Certainly.
necessity for it.
And, well, those are the ones that we're looking at there that we want to shore up. And in the 5-year forecast next week, we'll be showing you what the impact is on those. At this point, we do look to end the year with general fund reserve at 35.7%. And our target at this point, as adopted by council policy, is 30 to 35%. So all things considered, the organization is operationally healthy. We have the reserves that we have desired and aspired to, even despite the dissolution of redevelopment, as we've discussed at length at the beginning of this current year. As you indicated, sir, these are the internal service funds that we are looking to shore up. Some of these funds have negative fund balances. Others, we do have the cash. But the idea here is that we want to be able to put enough into these funds such that all of our assessments long-term are able to be funded. We know that, for example, we should be putting more money into the ISD infrastructure fund. Without doubt, each year we are looking for new investments, new technology, new equipment, and programming to be funded by ISD. It would be ideal to be able to have that fund fully funded and then sustained through the cost allocation that occurs each year. Bob, is there anything else that you wanted to add to those ones?
Well, no, just actually, the first three funds that we've listed there are the ones, as Scott mentioned, that have deficits through the end of last year. The workers' compensation fund being the worst at $17 million. And as Scott said, the infrastructure funds and ISD are underfunded. Recall, we just put those funds in place a couple years ago, so they weren't funded to the extent that they needed to be. Now that we've identified the costs and what our forecast would need to be in equipment replacement. Fleet, along with public works staff, Steve's folks have put in a lot of work identifying equipment replacement, length of service years, types of equipment. We reduced the fleet. It's still underfunded, even though we've reduced the fleet quite a bit and stretched out the length of vehicles to the extent that we can. We now have a pretty good idea what the costs are. There are variables with fuel going up and down. We have to incorporate that into the fleet costs, but the capital costs are underfunded. Realizing we have some very expensive pieces of equipment that at times need to be replaced, and they are very expensive, and they come out of this fund. So we've identified these as needs long-term. Short-term, they're okay. The funds are operating okay, but ideally, we would like to bolster the funding for those.
I'd just like to say, I hope that the money is kept in there except for the needed purpose.
Yeah.
Governor Schwarzenegger set up a rainy day account, and the state, in all their wisdom, zeroed it out. And now Mr. Perez is going to establish another rainy day fund. So I hope, in this city at least, the money goes there, is only utilized for the purposes.
And that is exactly the purpose for internal service funds, is we identify common costs for certain purposes. The compensation fund only pays workers' comp expenses. ISD is only for the sole purpose of providing the software and the infrastructure for those items. We control the cost by putting them in common funds and then charging out.
So once we put the money in the fund, council can't take it back out to use for other general.
You certainly can. That's your prerogative. Our recommendation is to keep it in those funds and use it for the intended purpose.
But if we take it out, I hope it's in the press that we took it out. Mr. Najarian.
Mr. Elliott, did you say the compensation insurance fund is the most underfunded at this point?
Yes. As of last June, our deficit fund balance was $17.7 million.
I would like to, I'm getting the feeling that we're losing control on those expenses. And I would like to have another meeting, whether it's with just staff or with council. The MTA had that same problem, and they instituted a unique strategy to aggressively, super aggressively pursue those cases and defend those cases. And in the end, it turned it around significantly. The payouts were smaller, and there were less claims ultimately done. So at some point, let's make a little footnote. Let's go back and see what we can do with the compensation insurance.
Staff have any problem with that?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. We have some information coming up in the presentation that deals with that very issue. So most certainly.
I was just going to say, I can tell you, this has been a topic of a lot of conversations in the time I've been here, and realizing we're self-administered in-house, but a lot of what the payouts are directly mandated by state law. So there's not a lot of leeway, but there is some, and we are looking at that. I know Matt's staff is looking at other ways to address comp claims and reduce them. We've worked with the associations to get certain costs, MRIs or whatever the issue is, done so they're not out as long as they are. So we have worked on it. There is work to be done, though.
Bob will take you through what our adjustments are for the current year as we close out. There are several things we want to bring to the council's attention.
First and foremost is the appropriation for the $1.9 million. I mentioned that earlier. It's the property tax administration fee that was part of the lawsuit with the county that the city settled with, and that's $1.9 million. And the second one is gas tax, is shifting some appropriations within the gas tax fund, and there's an impact to the general fund in that there is capacity now in the gas tax fund to take on some of the things that were previously in the general fund. And lastly, it's just kind of a cleanup in the general fund. So let me walk you through those. As I mentioned, the property tax administration fee was $1.9 million. We are recommending that we appropriate that money and put it into the insurance fund for the time being, primarily to use to fund for the build-out of our INET. This is one of the results of the charter lawsuit was the INET. It's a fiber system that connects our campuses. We no longer have the ability to use that, so we have to either build our own or rent from them at a horrendous monthly fee of $40,000 or $50,000. It is a lot. So it's in our best interest to build it out as soon as possible. We're recommending we put that in the insurance fund, and then when we have a project plan put together, that we bring that back to appropriate to the specific project. Second item, as I mentioned, is gas tax. This was a strategy that we came up with this year, and we're bringing it to you today in terms of moving, reprogramming streets and sidewalks and slurry seal items that are now can be used and programmed in the gas tax fund. So this would relieve the general fund of $1.1 million in expenditures for this year and moving forward, and then reprogramming those costs within the gas tax fund. Again, that's no increase in the gas tax fund appropriation. There is money that's available within the gas tax to cover these expenses. And in connection with that, again, that would reduce $1.1 million out of the general fund in terms of appropriation. And if you recall, we had a $617,000 estimated savings. That was the amount of the $15.4 million that we didn't achieve. So it was compensating our plug factor at this point. So we want to eliminate that. So the net reduction would be $492,000 in the general fund. The other, moving on to the financing authority and the lease, as you recall, I said earlier that the city had entered in with the financing authority some time ago to utilize the PEG fees, which we collect on our charter bills, and use specifically for capital, or as they're intended to be used for capital. We constructed a lease between the financing authority and the general fund to recognize that money coming back to the general fund. Unfortunately, the courts basically invalidated that lease. So what we're needing to do was take that lease structure and pull it out and reassign the revenues back to the city into the PEG fund, and then just go forward from there. It's, and Mike can talk to you more of the status of the lawsuit, but it's basically under appeal at this point. But we have not paid the lease since the court decision, and the money's still being collected. It's put into the PEG access fund, but this would allow us to free up that money and spend it on capital as it's intended.
And let me just add, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, it's essentially abating the lease, so we're agreeing, the city and the PFA are agreeing not to make those lease payments until the lawsuit is resolved. It is not terminating the lease. The lease is still in existence until we've resolved that issue through final adjudication.
But just so I'm clear on the history, the whole reason that we set up the financing authority was to have an argument that the PEG fee transmittal.
Well, the financing authority was
valid.
created at the time that we did the COPs for the police building, but we used the financing authority, the lease structure, to basically capitalize the income stream that comes from the PEG fees. Because essentially, as Mr. Elliott stated, the city front-loaded the capital cost for the construction of the GTV6 facility. So we, in our view, we were just repaying ourselves that cost.
And that went fine until the court invalidated.
That's correct.
So there's really no purpose then to continue that.
Until such time as it's resolved.
Okay.
Looking ahead to next year, you recall at mid-year again, as I alluded to earlier, that we had projected a relatively small budget deficit for the coming year, but that much of that deficit could be erased operationally if we were to basically hold flat the internal service fund contributions. As we just indicated a moment ago, however, we'll be able to make good on a number of those deposits in the current fiscal year by way of savings generated by the operations of the departments. And again, I have to point out, that is not savings entirely emanating from vacancies of budgeted unfilled positions. A lot of that is savings in the M&O accounts of our line departments. Because we, at this point, are doing better than expected on revenue, we're doing better than expected on expense, we actually anticipate, instead of a $4 million gap heading into next year, approximately a $1 to $1.2 million gap heading into next year. A less than 1% variation of what it is that we budget each year in the general fund. In order to fill that on a going forward basis, there are a number of options that the City Council is going to be able to consider in the coming weeks, whether or not we use one-time savings to fill that from the current fiscal year and allow that to carry over as fund balance, whether or not we get additional property tax from the dissolution of redevelopment as a taxing entity, just our share as City of Glendale, that 13.5 cents on the dollar of the property tax dollar. We are under the, we have been advised by the Department of Finance that we will be getting the first chunk, which is kind of a catch-up amount of that property tax later on this summer that would accrue to this current fiscal year. And reportedly from DOF, that amount more than shores up what the proposed deficit would be, or anticipated deficit would be. We have managed vacancies. At this point, I believe we have a score of vacancies within the police department that even under the most aggressive recruitment and training schedule, we could not fill every one of those police department vacancies, yet they are indeed funded. We could use some of those funds to shore up that deficit, or we could do other small types of discretionary reductions within the departments. But the point being that it is an infinitely solvable problem as compared to last year, or this current year, or the previous year.
Mr. Toy,
Yes, sir.
you said we would know from the state in June sometime. Okay, should the council be setting a priority on the other options available in case we don't, so it goes into effect, if it hits, we can drop the others? And
Well, we have received the preliminary indication from the state that we are getting it. We'd like to see the final, so I think that is money that you can indeed count on. And it is a larger chunk in this for this current fiscal year than it would be in future years. Again, just us as a taxing entity.
understand, but there's a chance we won't. It looks good. Should we be prepared in case Sacramento does what they always do, reverses themselves? If they did, should we collectively have looked at, okay, we're not going to get that money, we want to do this or this?
Well, that's why I think these other options that are here in front of you more than make up that amount. For example,
I understand that, but should we assess and tell you which of the four or a combination of those?
as I say, for example, managed vacancies in the police department, conservatively, we think that we can reserve $700,000 from the department, not defund those positions, have the positions there, but basically rely on that money
Unfunded this year.
in the coming fiscal year. Moreover, as we indicated previously, we do have savings from the current fiscal year. So it's less a matter, I'm not trying to be argumentative, I'm just saying that you have those resources available by way of priority. It's going to be one of these things.
Let me translate another way. If we don't get the money, will staff decide what to do to balance?
So let me clarify that. The property tax that we hope to get, we have not factored in. We're not counting on it. So if we do get it, then we can program it and use it, but we have not counted
So
on
we're
it.
not balanced for $1 million or so?
We're not balanced based off what we
Million or
think
so
we
in a
might
hole.
get. No.
We would use one of these tools to balance that 1.1.
And what I'm asking, will staff go ahead and take care of that and tell us what you did, or will you come back sometime?
No, we would come back as part of this budget presentation in this month and show you how we would hope to address these.
Okay, because the end of June, we have to adopt the budget.
Right.
So you'll have to, either you have it programmed in one of the briefings coming up, here's what we'll do if we don't get the state money. That's in the briefing
That
statement.
would be, that'll be discussed this month, but even because of the small amount that it represents, it would be shown to you very, very clearly at the budget hearing in June. It's less than a percent.
It can't be the day before we adopt the budget.
When we talk about this notion of structural versus operational, we are operationally balanced. We talked about this last year and again, most certainly. We pay our bills, we light the lights, we provide the level of service that the community has become accustomed to, and we are making great strides in developing this structural balance, meaning we have that laundry list of things that need to be done to our house, whether it's a new roof or new pipes or new flooring or what have you, things that are not necessarily pressing in the foreground but need to be addressed, and they're on that list of things to do. And we're approaching those in the current year and even more so in the future years. But this notion of operational versus structural is important because I think Mr. Weaver alludes to it. It's things that we keep in the foreground, the things we keep in the background. Council needs to be aware of where it stands at all times, not just this year, but in the years looking out. Perhaps the biggest challenge that is facing us in that intermediate and short range is pension costs. Now, Glendale leads the region in terms of the pension reform that you have negotiated with all of your employees. We have the employee pay the full employee portion, as well as many of our associations, all of our associations pay some portion of the employer's share, and some pay more than others, and we're looking to align that as we go forward. The issue that has impacted us most recently over the last several weeks is that the PERS board, I'm sure you have read, has taken an action whereby their actuarial assessments and values for a 15-year period in order to recoup the losses that they suffered during the Great Recession have been compressed into a 5-year window. What that means is that you will see our PERS rates in the general fund go up by about $10 million citywide over the next several years. That is significant, most definitely.
But I want to add, because we get attacked continuously on the PERS, we have no control over what they're doing up there. They want to compress from 15 down to 5. It hurts us. We have no control.
Correct.
Yes.
So
Moreover, I think it's a fair statement that the PERS board, in trying to recover from their own mismanagement, quite frankly, if you look at the controversies that they've dealt with over the last several years, that they are frustrating to local agencies, to participating agencies, because they've taken a high hand with all of these agencies. Their attitude has been, well, if you want to leave PERS, that's fine. We're just going to send you a rather exorbitant bill, and you're still going to have to pay us and pay for whatever program you move forward with, and not really recognize that the decisions that they're making are putting major strains on agencies, participating agencies in real time, and that in and of itself has a very significant impact on how folks view the PERS program, the PERS benefit. As you know right now, both San Bernardino and Stockton, two cities that range from dysfunctional to economically bankrupt, are dealing with the overextension of their organizations now. And how they interact with PERS will have an impact even on economically healthy cities like Glendale, depending on which way the bankruptcy courts go, depending on how PERS interacts, as well as any of the other creditors. The idea being that bankruptcy, in my professional opinion, ought not be a solution for those economically healthy agencies that don't really need to file for that protection because of all the downstream negative impacts it has on the community. My fear, though, is that there are some agencies that maybe are not as badly off as a San Bernardino or a Stockton, and not as well off as a Glendale, who may look at whatever the bankruptcy courts do as an opportunity for them to do something precipitous and perhaps short-sighted. And PERS needs to be a little more sensitive to the way that they're impacting the member agencies.
I assume that PERS will react to public pressure when and if it comes. The other thing, if they compress it into 5 years, I read that, but after that 5 years, then what happens? Does it level or go down over time?
Actually, they're saying that they'll go up and spike in 5 years and then start leveling off,
Leveling off, not
assuming the
Not
actuarial assumptions of 7.5%, which, again, that they're outstripping at this year in terms of what the rate of return is. But
And I
that's
remember
they're
what
building.
actuarial advice we got in 2000 about being superfunded. Here we are today.
Yep.
Mr. Najarian?
So tell me again, why can't we pull out of PERS and negotiate with our employment groups a different type of retirement plan, something like a defined contribution rather than a defined benefit?
Couple of reasons. There is a promise between the employer and the employee today, so that if you were going to remove yourself from the PERS system effective tomorrow, so everybody that's here today is part of one tier, everybody that is coming in later is part of a totally different program. That change and that promise would have to be negotiated with your employees. Now, if you were to implement that on those employees, the problem that PERS is counting on, the problem that we would face practically speaking, is that we're still on the hook for all of the cost for those previous promises, as well as the cost of whatever the new promise would be. So as a divorce settlement, if you will, it would be exorbitantly expensive, and PERS, as I say, has taken a bit of a high hand in terms of counting on that and thus keeping all of their member agencies together. The fear that I would have is that if the system starts to implode on itself because there is no sensitivity on their part to those agencies that, again, are not as well off as Glendale, but not nearly as badly off as some of those cities living hand to mouth. Those cities in the middle are the ones that have probably the greatest impact, because if one goes and starts a chain reaction, that would impact what PERS ultimately does long term.
I mean, it just seems an extreme burden on the cities to be hit with these increases year after year, and the basic assumption of the PERS board that there's a 7% return to be made either in the market or through contributions. Glendale has led the way in the state for a lot of our contracts and our retirement issues. Why don't we look into some other way of doing that? I mean, I understand that this is your understanding, but let's really get into it and let them know that we're not happy with these huge increases. We're not happy with the way they manage the fund. I mean, that's what it boils down to, essentially, is that we're not happy with the way they're managing it, their lack of foresight, their lack of acumen, investment acumen, and let them know that we're not happy. And maybe other cities will join us, and that we can generate some reform up there in terms of the contributions. I mean, this 5-year blending is a huge hit.
It is huge.
I mean, the 15-year previous was okay; it was doable, but this is a huge hit. That's
Recall the 15-year was implemented, I think, in 05 or 06, and that was a direct result from agencies complaining about the severe rate spikes up and down because of the investment return. So they smoothed it out over 15. When they lost the 24%, now they actually lost 24%, but actuarially they lost 30 because it's the 24 plus the 7.25. There wasn't enough going into the fund to actually meet their actuarial assumptions. So that's why they're proposing or have gone back to the 5-year, which we used to have. And then instead of this 30-year rolling average on the actuarial gains and losses, they're actually clamping that and putting it a fixed 30 years. So the whole point is to get back to a fully funded status within the end of 30 years, as opposed to this rolling 30-year average that they used. The 7.25% or 7.5% assumed rate of return actually is good for us. They are looking at the idea of knocking it down 1/4 or 0.5%. That would raise our rates even more. Fortunately, their rate of return historically has been pretty good. Granted, the 24% that they had a couple of years ago, they lost $100 billion. They have since recaptured that. They're back up to about $260 billion in the portfolio for all the different funds and agencies. So they've made some huge gains back, but that hit got them down to about a 70%, I think 70% overall funded status. Now, each plan has their little chunks of that. And
They're back to normal now, you say? They recouped that
they're not
100?
quite. I mean,
Most part.
their losses haven't impacted their funded, and with the payouts that they have, and payouts are increasing, they have to implement these factors in order to increase the cash inflow. Now, bear in mind, every pension, the amount of contributions that cities contribute, the most pensions are paid for by about 65 to 70% of the investment earnings that go in over the course of an employee's life from either the employer or employee contributions. So investments pay for the majority of what the pension promises are in the out years. So it's not so much the contributions, but that's what keeps the machine going.
And certainly we can appreciate what they're trying to do. What the intention is to set themselves on the right footing in as short amount of time as possible. And that's why when you look at their curves over the 5 years, things start to level off and start to come back down. And so and begin to normalize. The problem is actually getting to that 5-year window. And you're right, sir. When you look at 15 years, when that occurred, that was a pill for cities to swallow. Now they've compressed it further with the promise that good times are around the corner if you can get to 5 years. But in not being readily willing to have some flexibility, they end up jeopardizing themselves because there are a lot of cities, many cities, have finally done what Glendale has already done. Gone to tier, went to the type of pension program that had existed in California through PERS for generations and generations. When you started to see the more exotic programs come through in the 1990s, that's where things started to run aground. I think we're back to the past at this point. Question is, can cities sustain it long enough to get to that normalized period of time?
Well, I know that PERS has been under the microscope. They've got new board members. Maybe they will clean up their act, but I don't know if the city's sending a letter up and telling them we don't like what we want to do. I just can't believe Sacramento's going to listen to little old Glendale.
Is the League of Cities involved in this? I mean,
League of
this
Cities
seems
has
this
taken
is right up
positions.
their alley.
Yeah, they have taken positions on this matter. PERS being this quasi-governmental agency, especially on the heels of the controversies that they had for the pay-to-play type of schemes that had been uncovered, I think that the folks, as Mr. Weaver alludes to, you have new board members here who are here to give the hard medicine. And they're going to right the ship, and they're clinging very dearly to that. And it's laudable on one degree, but it also has to be practical for the participating agencies.
That's where I say, if it isn't going to work, they're going to hear it from many cities across the state. You're driving us into bankruptcy, et cetera. Then they'll have to retune what they are trying to do.
I think that day
Well,
is still
from what I heard, or read, not heard,
Mr. Cotero.
their biggest losses were in real estate and in private equity funds that they invested in. So I think they learned that lesson. And I think their overall investments, as you mentioned, are going up along with the rest of the market. So hopefully they're going to turn the corner.
Stock's doing okay.
Thus, I think that leaves everything very good comments, certainly, and insights. I'm sorry, ma'am. We talked about our business really changing. And the balance here for the City Council in making policy is making sure that our operational costs don't overwhelm or crowd out our ability to provide a level of service. The good news for Glendale is that when you look at all of our performance indicators, that we're still delivering the level of service. And so the ability to provide value to the taxpayer and the business owner here in Glendale is not being compromised. We're able to still deliver on that value proposition. The issue for us is going to be doing something kind of what Mr. Najarian is talking about, is pausing long enough to study the issue and say, okay, if we are going to If PERS is coming back, the economy is coming back, and we are looking essentially at re-staffing our organization, rebuilding our organization, presuming that we have now weathered the storm. The policy question for the council is, would we rebuild it in the same way? Or would we build a new structure? Or what would that structure look like? And what is the intersection between the functionality, marketability to talented people to want to be here, and service delivery to the community? That's a discussion that will occur over the coming years, and that's why as we show you that 5-year forecast next week, it's important to see how we're able to maintain our operational balance, and then what premium does the council put on getting to that structural balance sooner versus later. With that, any questions on just a glimpse of next year before we move on to the organizational profile?
I think we asked a lot of questions already. Is any more?
Then let's talk about where we are as the organization. You've seen a good deal of this information, so I will move quickly through it, but certainly we can stop and talk about observations that the council has. We have all of our staff present for any specific questions before I turn it over to Mr. Tokhtalian. Again, for the current year as adopted, you look at our population, we look at our employee size, 1,605, almost 900 of them in the general fund. Total adopted budget, $700 million, 165.5 in general fund adopted budget. You see that we have gone up in the number of residents served per FTE, which is an indication of this number dropping significantly. We talk about the same type of relationship here in the general fund, and budget per capita actually going down, both overall in the organization and less so in general fund, because as you recall, a lot of our general fund departments, or the general fund primarily, 2/3 of the general fund is, more than 2/3 is public safety. We've tried to hold public safety as harmless as possible, though they have contributed in different ways to shoring up the budget. We talk about debt. Debt comes up a lot in terms of what the long-term debt for city of Glendale is. The COPS, or the certificates of participation here for the GPD facility, we will be bringing to you a refinancing of this debt in the coming weeks. Bob Elliott and his team, through dogged negotiation with banks, have delivered to us an outstanding interest rate to take these COPs and transfer them into a more traditional financing structure. We do have revenue bonds outstanding from utility and from the agency. We have claims that are still payable. Landfill closure liability, this is something that we have to maintain, so when the landfill does close, we're able to shore up our obligations to making sure it is environmentally suitable. We have our compensated absences, as you know, and the post-employment benefits that we have currently outstanding. Altogether, $381 million worth of outstanding debt. That said, however, it's important that you look at everything in context. Liquidity ratios. This number here tells you the number of times that our assets can cover our liabilities. And for Glendale at 6.4. That is something that is very strong and reflects the overall long-term strength of the city of Glendale. By the same token, when you look at our debt ratios and debt to equity, it shows you that the amount of assets versus the total liabilities that we have reflects that we are a very strong organization, especially when you consider that the industry average for these numbers is hovering around 35%. And here we are at 20%. That's a credit both to this council and councils that have come before to be very fiscally conservative.
Make sure you keep that sheet here at the dais, so when we get criticized every time on our debt, you can pull that out.
Yes, sir. We had talked a little bit before about workers' compensation and how we look on paper. You can see that the claims are still there, 13% utilization for workers' comp versus 15% in 2012. We are hopeful in this current calendar year to be able to drive this number down. Council had approved performance goals for our departments, particularly public safety departments and our field departments, Public Works and GWP, to try and drive that number down. Total number of claims open, and you can see what the utilization is like between those most highly or most frequent using departments. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, no real trend yet to speak of, but we'll be a lot smarter as we're able to look at 2013. I think the one to take away is the $41,727 per claim. Not as much as that's the median incurred, not as much as some of the more sensational numbers that get reported every now and again, but most certainly it is a significant dollar, especially when you multiply it by the number of claims that we have. It is a cost of doing business. We will always have a cost for workers' compensation. Our goal as managers is to drive that cost down by driving down the number of claims open. By the same token, we look at general liability. We have, you see, gone down from 11 to 12. 13, when we show you the numbers coming up this month for our liability claims for 13, we're hopeful that that number will drop further. We still have 255 open claims. The departments that generally have claims filed against them are shown here. And for the most part, we're going down. Public Works, your trip and falls, and things of that nature are showing some increase. But again, $17,000 the amount incurred per claim. Significantly different from, again, the higher numbers that occasionally, sporadically will spring up, but certainly something that we have to be mindful of. Tail of the tape for revenue. This is something that we have to continue to show because it speaks to the legacy of, in this case here at property tax, of Prop 13. When you consider that we are here at $226 per capita for property tax revenue coming in, Burbank, which is about 50% of our size, has per capita higher, and Pasadena, which is about 60% our size, at $288 per capita. Both of those two communities reflect a higher percentage of the property tax that is recaptured on each dollar paid. We get about 13.5 cents. Burbank gets, I believe, 18 cents.
18.5.
Pasadena, I believe, gets 21 cents on each property tax dollar paid. It's easy to say, well, that really doesn't matter. That's 1978, and we just have to get used to it and live with it. And indeed, we do. But at the same time, when folks like to comparison shop, you need to understand, where that money goes and how that money is locked in, and we are locked in with it. Similarly, when you look at sales tax, again, we are down. This number is drawn down generally by the fact that we are larger. But I'll tell you, sales tax for Glendale is in 12-13. The projection is $31.3 million. For Burbank, it's $22.38, and for Pasadena, $31.995. The idea here, I think, is that we, as a historically bedroom community, and land use, you talk about these land use decisions, that 50-year decision, 100-year decision on land use. When you think of large, big box retailers, you're not generally thinking of Glendale. We have a tremendous auto row. We have an outstanding regional mall. And we have really two when you consider in the Americana. But Glendale has historically been the place that L.A. County, North L.A. County, comes to do business, meaning we focus on employment. And the sector of employment that we focus on, finance, insurance, and real estate, was decimated by the recession. On the flip side, and historically, Glendale has been this bedroom community with much of the available non-residential land space concentrated in a couple of different districts.
Mr. Cho, that's what I went through. Since I was born and raised here, for decades, Glendale was referred to as the bedroom community of Los Angeles. You worked in Los Angeles, you drove to Glendale before freeways, and your homes were here. So we never went to the big development types.
And so we will, and we are today, certainly trying to drive this number up, both by attracting jobs to come to Glendale, because employees will shop, they'll eat, they'll do all the things that we want them to do to generate local sales tax, but also to re-tenant underperforming locations within the city. I think realistically, when you look at our land use mix, we probably can get to this amount. We will have a hard time catching them here. By UUT, the utility user tax feature, the amount that we recapture through our set percentages on the UUT, we're looking at 6.5% on telecommunications, 6.5% on video, 7% electric, water, and gas. And when you look at other agencies, take Pasadena, for example, they're at 8.28 for telecommunications, 9.4 on video, 7.65 on electricity, 7.65 on water, 7.9 on gas. Most definitely they are going to be drawing in more money than what we are doing here. Same token, we have relatively today fewer hotel buildings in town as opposed to Burbank, as opposed to Pasadena. This actually we are working to change. We have the Marriott project. We just approved the Hampton Inn, and there are plans still for more as we talk to interested investors in looking to come to Glendale. The idea being that we will have an impact here, but it would be outstanding to be able to have additional impact here. Through the development that the council has approved in the downtown core, this number will start to jump up a little bit, but again, because we only get 13.5 cents on that dollar, it won't be as dramatic as folks in the community might want to otherwise believe.
Mr. Comment, I used to buy the Cosmont report back in the mid-'90s. I studied every city in Southern California, and we're the lowest taxed. That's shown right here. I mean Southern California. Whenever you talk about an additional tax here, take any market or retail store that's in other cities, right away they object to any tax increase in Glendale. But what they're doing is making more profit in this city because our tax structure is lower than the other cities. But they don't want to talk about that. And one thing I'd like to, you can recall very briefly, Prop 13, I know was put in. We're so low because, and I can't remember the reason, I know Glendale was very conservative at the time of Prop 13, and I forget now, what did we do because we were so conservative, they ended up giving us a lower number than Burbank and Pasadena.
As those
Recall?
numbers, it had to do with the relative affluence of the community in terms of what the tax burden was for the individual jurisdiction, and it froze those numbers in time without
The tax burden we had at the time, which Glendale being very conservative didn't
Kept it
tax,
really low.
kept it really low, and then we were caught.
But bear in mind, too, and this happened in the early and mid-'90s, that the state shaved layers of the property tax off in the educational revenue augmentation fund. So Glendale was about, I think, 16 cents on the dollar, and that got lowered down in two steps to 13.5. Burbank was at 22 at one point, got lowered to 20, and now 18.5. That is a permanent revenue shift that went to the state. We calculated that a couple of years ago, and that since that shift, that cost the state, city of Glendale over $100 million in property tax for that one single item alone. Now, add that all up, that's permanent revenue shift back to the state to fund the ERAF.
Which makes it that much more difficult for us to balance our budgets with less revenue
The burden
than
was just
virtually
passed
any city around.
In terms of how we spend our money, net of transfers and other budget balancing strategies, you see here more than half goes to public works, utilities, and transit, the customary types of municipal services that folks are used to receiving. About 20% goes to public safety. We do spend 6.3 on community development, planning, code enforcement, things like that. Quality of life being your softer services by way of parks, libraries, and then administration and internal service, all the business apparatus that exists within the organization. This is an interesting one that we will be presenting to you in the coming months, and I'll tease it here. You've seen this before in terms of what our total salaries and benefits are. You see in 9-10 we were at $222 million. Today we're at $218. Over that period of time we've dropped 9%. Our operating costs, again, have dropped in real dollars from 9-10 to 12-13. The ratio that we use, and this is over all budgets, not general fund, you can see how we have actually dropped a little bit from 35.2 down to 34.7. Our goal, as you recall, is to keep that near a third of overall operating costs, recognizing that the operating costs here in all funds reflect the energy purchases in particular of GWP that inflate the overall city budget. Our employee count, the tail of the tape here, 1605 full-time equivalents, a drop of 14% from 910. And I can tell you that as you look to 1314, what we are projecting is 1,588 full-time equivalent positions. You would have to go back to sometime in the 1990s to get to when Glendale was that lean. When you look at salaries and benefits for general funds, same types of ratios, you can see how we've dropped in terms of salaries and benefits. Maintenance and operations ISF charges has gone up in the general fund as that those ISFs get allocated out to the different departments. Last year, you see that we did finally start putting some, not finally, I shouldn't characterize it that way, but we did increase the amount ever so slightly of what we put into CIP. Long story short, 1.5% reduction. But here is the real indication that we focus on in this table, 79.8%. Our target, as you know, is 75% in the general fund, personnel to M&O costs. For the coming fiscal year, I can tell you that we are looking at this point at 78.7. Still not to the target that we want, but making good progress in that direction to ensure that we are as absolutely lean as possible. Again, considering 2/3 of the budget goes towards public safety, and we've tried to hold them as harmless as possible, we are making good progress in that arena.
Mr. Quintero.
I just want to comment that statistics, so that our workforce understands. I mean, this is what's going on in private sector companies because of the type of electrical and IT services that all of these gadgets provide, whether it's manufacturing, service industries, you name it. Financial industries don't have as many employees. So I think it's not that Mr. Ochoa is a rough and tumble guy that wants to cut personnel. The bottom line is it's happening across the board in private sector companies, big and small.
Most definitely.
Just aside, I watched a special on TV, and it started, I didn't know what it was doing. It started at the beginning, and it was bending a piece of metal. No workers. Went clear through, and it showed pieces putting together, and through the whole thing was the building of a car with virtually any workers. Virtually any. Guy polishing at the end and fitting a couple of things, all done by computers. As an example of where we're going in a lot of industries. What do you do with the people that are laid off? So it's a big challenge for the whole country.
And my apologies, I said CIP. We are putting $320,000 in this current fiscal year into CIP. This is just capital outlay for the different operations. And you see that's increased as we've moved more operations into the general fund with the dissolution of redevelopment. That's separate from CIP. Here on this one, you've seen this slide too, management versus non-management, trying to make sure that we are as lean as possible. Our target here is 20%. We are at 18.1 in the current fiscal year. We are about 18.8 is our projection for the coming fiscal year. So once again, we are maintaining a very, very trim and lean operation in terms of span of control for our employees. This is something you've seen before, but it's important to point out because it also speaks back to the issue of the PERS calculation and what the impact and the cost of doing business for a full-service city like Glendale. When we showed this last year, we made sure that we put it in the context of all of the costs of doing business. Accrued time has value as an employer. The insurances for our employees has value. All of our costs, the whole miscellany of things that we have to pay as the employer, our retirement, and the cost share this is the offset paid by our employees. What you're seeing here is that the benefit roll-up for every dollar we're paying 59.18 on safety in 11-12, and this projected year 13-14, that number is at 63.63. For non-safety 1112, the roll-up was 40, now it's 46. And you can see the real impact here in retirement, something that that has been hitting cities like Glendale for some time. But at the same time, we urge that we keep perspective in mind, because the 38-year average safety rate for the employer was 22.39%. For non-safety, it's 11.75%. And as you look through the years beginning in 1976, those numbers have been all over the place. As Mr. Weaver had indicated, as recently as 2001, the rates were zero because PERS was superfunded and wasn't requiring contributions from member agencies. I think the highest here ever was back in 1981. And so we do take a long-term perspective, and that's what we would urge PERS to do, and that's what we want to make sure that we are using as part of the context and understanding what total compensation costs the City of Glendale for the level of services that we provide in the City of Glendale. Similarly, as I indicated before, 1605 is the employee count for the current fiscal year. Looking back here to 99, 2000, 1612, you would have to go back sometime in the 1990s to get to that lower number of 1588 that we're talking about for the coming fiscal year. We have, as you recall from last year, City Council priorities, and the way that that all of this cascades together is we continue to say Council sets the tone. Council sets those priorities. Those priorities are what give, that animate the strategic goals for all the different departments that really start to focus on what those outcomes are. And from those strategic goals, we draw the key performance indicators. If you think of this as the strategy and the KPI as the tactics that measure the how and how well, measures of cost efficiency. And so to the extent that the council sets the priority, the department directors and executive team take that and format them into goals, and then the various departments are able to measure their performance by way of the amount of potholes filled, the streets that are paved, and what have you. That is how all of this fits together and really underscores how important this process is. And so these being the City Council's priorities from the current fiscal year, what we will ask you and submit this to you all is to think about these goals, fiscal responsibility being the number one goal, followed by exceptional customer service, and you see how they blend down from there, to determine whether or not the council wants to keep these as your priorities, if the council wants to reorder these priorities, and really help set that tone for the departments as we construct next year's budget. Because truly, if they've changed or if they need to be reordered, whatever they are, they have to reflect the council's vision. Again, the council sets the tone.
But one thing, at least in my humble opinion, it's because of the clarity of the information that's developed by staff coming to us, so we can easily understand the big picture. That's a big factor, because if all we got was muddled information in, we'd have trouble being as efficient, supposedly, as we are up here.
We try to provide that executive level of information for you to make those policy choices, so thank you.
Doing a good job.
At this point, I'm going to turn it over to John Toktalian, our Deputy City Manager, who will briefly go through the department dashboards and any questions you may have on indicators, and then certainly take questions from council as we go forward.
Mr. Toktalian.
Thank you, Mayor Weaver, members of the City Council. Over the last few quarters, you've seen me come up here and provide an update for that particular quarter's key performance indicators for each department. In the interest of brevity, I'm not going to go into the fine detail for each department. However, we do have staff here in the audience that can answer any questions you might have after having taken a look at the details that were attached at the end of the particular report. I will say, however, that the KPIs for the most part are tracking fairly steadily between the first, second, and third quarters. Where there were changes or fluctuations, we've gone ahead and identified them in the trend analysis portion of the staff report, which starts on page 8, and that's broken down by individual departments. If there's any questions on any of those, again, we have individuals in the audience who can answer that. But before we move past key performance indicators and go into department dashboards, I wanted to point out a few things about performance indicators. First, they were developed to assess our department's programs and operations and to determine whether or not we were actually being effective. Were we being successful? Is there some failures? Or are we just maintaining the status quo? The second really important thing that I want to point out is the difference between outputs and outcomes. These key performance indicators were specifically devised to measure outputs. What the departments do with those outputs is take a look at what those numbers are. We know what the baseline should be. If there's fluctuations, we'll dig deeper and determine what the outcomes actually are. That's the basis for getting into that qualitative level of analysis. The final thing is to maintain a contextual perspective when we're looking at these key performance indicators. Just because numbers may go up and down doesn't necessarily mean that that we're being more successful or there's a downward trend. The example that I like to use is that of DUI enforcement. If you see that your DUI arrests or citations have increased, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have more drunk drivers on the street. That could be a testament to the fact that you have better enforcement strategies or some more targeted enforcement during that particular quarter. So moving on into the department dashboards, we've broken it down into three separate sections as in previous quarters. On the upper left quadrant is the budget information and the percent expended. On the top right quadrant is the personnel numbers, breaks it down into the number of executive managers and non-managers within the operation. And down below is the strategic goals for each department that are devised annually between the city manager and the department head. You'll notice that with the administrative services, they have a total budget of about almost $5.1 million. And their manager counts are roughly around 32%, non-manager 64%. And a couple of their strategic goals are to develop and implement an online reporting system for strategic management, developing and implementing expenditure control budget pilot program for the general fund, and to seek opportunities to refinance, renegotiate, and rebid contracts. City Attorney's Office similarly has about $10.6 million budget, the majority of which is actually in the M&O account. I believe it's the liability fund. Personnel, about 27.5% managers, 67% non-managers, and a couple of their strategic goals are to defend the city's interests in all litigation matters and reduce the liability and workers' compensation claims year over year. City Clerk's Office, one of the smaller departments next to the City Treasurer's Office. They have a $1.3 million budget, and it's important to note here that you'll notice under M&O, they've only expended about 33% of their budget so far in the third quarter. The reason for that is because we just had our election, and those bills haven't necessarily either come in or been paid in full. So you'll notice that number will jump significantly by the time we look at the fourth quarter. And it's also a good time for me to let you know that in the fourth quarter, we will do a comparison between this time last year, or the fourth quarter ending last year, and fourth quarter ending this year. So we'll have some true comparison to look at. Again, 14.3% managers, 71% non-managers. City Treasurer, smallest one with 5 employees, 20% manager, 60% non. Community development, fairly large budget, again, mostly in M&O. They have about a 25% management to 73% non-management ratio. And a few of their strategic goals is to improve consistency, clarity, and turnaround times in development review and permitting, to implement economic development strategies to reduce Class A office vacancies by 10% within 5 years, and to implement business attraction efforts and reprogramming in downtown Glendale to implement that 18-hour business destination. Community Services and Parks, another large department, but with about a $40 million budget. Again, about 20% management ratio, which is what our target is right about now, and about 78% non-managers. And some of their key strategic goals is to complete their capital projects within time and cost targets of 45 days and 2.5% respectively, and improve cost recovery on rental assets by about 10%. Fire Department, $56.5 million budget, mostly in salaries and benefits. A total of 211 employees, 6.5% of which are managers, the vast majority at about 93% non-managers. And their strategic goals that we're focusing on mainly are increasing training hours for safety personnel by 7.5%, studying to reduce response times, and they are going to complete a comprehensive evaluation of the ALS-BLS program, which I believe we provided an update on last quarter. Glendale Water and Power is by far our largest department. Right after that is police. Total of 331 employees, $270 million budget, vast majority again in M&O. 13% managers, 86% non-managers, and just a few of their strategic goals: to complete a comprehensive rate analysis, complete bond financing cost effectiveness strategy, and developing and publishing a quarterly profit and loss statement. Human resources, again, you'll see that there's a fairly large budget at about $46.2 million, but again, the vast majority of that is in M&O, and that's mainly made up by our ISFs, unemployment, dental, medical, vision, and RHSP. Almost 21 employees, 24% of which are managers, and 71% non-managers. And they're focusing on refining and updating Glendale's in-house leadership development and assessment offerings, completing a citywide employee satisfaction survey, which is currently underway, and the results are being analyzed this week, and completing MOU negotiations with all bargaining groups. Information services, almost $26.5 million budget, total of about 47 full-time employees, and about 8.4% being managers, the vast majority at about 90% or 89.5% being non-managers. Their focus being to improve the city's IT infrastructure, ensure reliability, and to maximize grant funding to get us up to Project 25 compliant status in our wireless operation. Library, Arts, and Culture, $17.7 million budget. Much of that, about $9.5 million, being in their capital improvement fund. There's a number of projects currently underway, Brand Library being one of those. They have about 50 employees, 10% of which are managers, 88% non-managers. And their strategic goals include developing a branch library staffing plan that maximizes part-time and volunteer utilization, and developing a public arts strategic plan. Management services, $4.7 million budget. And you'll notice this is actually where we include City Council as part of the total employee count. So including City Council, we have about 26.5 employees. The half is because we have one employee who's charged out to a different account in the police department. 15.1% management, 50.9% non-management, and a number of executives just based on the operation. That includes internal audit as well. Some of our strategic goals include to maintain an internal audit closeout rate of about 66% or greater within 12 months of completing an audit, and completing the 2013 Citizen Satisfaction Survey. We've already met with the Rose Institute. That will begin, the planning of it will begin in June, and the actual surveys will occur sometime in July before people leave town and go on vacation, so we can get fairly diverse responses. Police department, similar to the fire department, about a $77.5 million budget, much of which is in salaries and benefits. Total of 351 employees, 5% being managers, 94.7% being non-managers. And their goals are to maintain community safety rankings among state and national crime indices, commencing the DNA lab operations, which is still going through the certification process. It is a fairly lengthy process, as I've learned, and preparing a white paper regarding opportunities in advanced law enforcement applied technologies. And finally, on to Public Works, another one of our very large departments with about a $230 million budget. Almost 300 employees, 10.5% of which are managers, vast majority, about 89.5% being non-managers. And some of their goals are to complete the Chevy Chase Water Conveyance System Diversion Project, construction of $35 million in capital infrastructure repair and upgrade projects, and completion of the Brand Library and Art Center renovation project. That completes the department dashboard presentation. If there's any questions on the KPIs, again, we have individuals from the different departments here who can step up and answer those for you.
Any questions? Mr. Talion, I think.
I was
Mr.
gonna say,
Quintero.
I think, that last bullet point about the conversion technology project, are we talking about the landfill, or?
Yes.
Okay, I think maybe we need to make that a little bit more.
Okay, well,
clear.
yeah, that's the industry jargon. We'll make it understandable. Sure.
General public understand.
Thank
At
you.
this point,
Yes.
We'll just leave you with this, and then certainly entertain any questions from council or the public. This is the schedule that we've outlined. Today is kind of the appetizer for the whole budget discussion. We'll be back on the 14th to do the 5-year forecast revenues and fees, and then we'll talk about the CIP in the third session, and then finally be back in front of you with actual departmental presentations and the wrap-up on the 28th, all focused on the budget hearing on the 11th of June, and hopefully, presumably, the adoption come June 25th.
Very good. I have one speaker card. Go to speaker. Mr. Milano. 3 minutes.
Mayor Weaver, may I request 4 minutes, please?
Would you like 2 minutes?
No, I wanted to request 4 or 5 minutes.
I said 3 minutes. If you'd like 2, I can reduce it to 2.
I'd like to, could you reset the clock for me, please? Thank you, Mayor Weaver, members of the City Council. My name is Herbert Milano. I'd like to give you my perception on this particular report. It's not necessarily a criticism of it, it's a suggestion on how this report could be made a little bit more nuanced with regard to what you need to do, in my suggestion, to evaluate it. Part of the problem of looking at the general fund without the portions or the comparisons needed from the internal funds means that you do not have a really full picture of the true costs that are occurring within the general fund. Even though these comply with all of the governmental accounting standards, it is a problem when you have a significant portion of your benefits within the internal service fund. It would be really nice to separate those things of the internal service funds that have to do with, let's say, helicopter and information systems and so forth, and separate those out from the personnel costs, and then take those personnel costs and move them into the, or put them side by side to the general fund so that you really have a sense of what the general fund trends are. There is I think, a need to separate the Glendale Water and Power and other enterprise funds from the sort of like the bulk look at the city's governmental activity. And I think towards the very end, as you were looking at the summary with regard to the key performance indicators section, with regard to salaries and benefits, M&O, and capital outlay, what I would suggest is that you request from the staff a 10-year trend with a graph on salaries and benefits combined, M&O, capital outlay, as you can see on slides 51, 52, and so forth. I think that gives you a better perspective. With regard to the issue, the huge issue of the pension system, the staff did prepare a fairly nice report giving us a history of it. It would be nice for them to have extended that out a little bit further. I don't have enough time to basically cover this, but I would suggest that you set one day, just one day, totally dedicated at really getting a full understanding of what is happening with CalPERS and the overall obligation. Because you're going to be winding up with a $45 million expenditure per year versus $8 million a year ago. And things have dramatically changed since the year 2001. Because the discount rate cannot be sustained, according to many individuals who are experts in this. It means that it has changed dramatically since the late 1970s. And that's a whole topic for you to have discussion, which I'm unable to do in this just 3 minutes.
Mr. Chuo, we need some motions
Yes, sir.
on this.
For the third quarter adjustments to close out this year, yes.
Okay, well, can we have a motion on, what do you call it, 1? Is that how you're saying it, Mr. Kasakian? Motion to note and file.
You could do
Finance report.
1A, B, and C together, and then take 1 and 1D as the financing authority.
1, 2,
I'm sorry, I'm looking at the
and
agenda.
1, 2, and 3. Yeah, the last one's the finance. Okay, is there a motion for 1,
move the item.
1, 2, and 3? Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call.
Roll calls for items 1A, B, and C. Council members Friedman,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Sinanian?
Yes.
Mayor Weaver?
Aye. And for the Finance Authority, is there a motion?
I will move for the Finance Authority.
Second, somewhere?
Second?
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Financing Authority members Friedman?
Yes.
Najarian?
Yes.
Quintero?
Yes.
Sinanian?
Yes.
Mayor Weaver?
Aye. We have a motion adjourned for the Finance
So moved.
Second.
and a motion.
Also, I'll adjourn.
Is there a second?
Adjourned.
And thank you all for coming. We'll see you again in the coming weeks.